Podcasting from the heart of the Gator Nation in Alachua County, Florida, this is Extension Cord, the podcast of UF-IFAS Extension Alachua County, where we plug in and bring UF-IFAS Extension to life. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Taylor Clem with UF-IFAS Extension here in Alachua County. Today, I have Stacie Greco with us, and she is with Alachua County Environmental Protection Department, where she serves as the Water Resources Program Manager. And today, we would like to just talk a little bit about Florida's waters and Florida's water resources and how it's impacting us on a daily basis. So, Stacie, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, I want to just start off. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do here in Alachua County?
Yeah, so I've had the pleasure of working with Alachua County's Environmental Protection Department for 16 years now. Started as an intern out in our creeks collecting water quality samples, started doing some outreach, got hired full-time, used to go to all of our wastewater treatment plants, moved into water conservation, and now I am the Water Resources Program Manager. So I'm in charge of water conservation, water quality, stormwater, education. If it has water in it, I probably have my paws in it.
So I think it's very appropriate that we have you on here today because with Extension here in Alachua County, we work with the Environmental Protection Department regularly on a lot of different projects. We have a really great partnership. So I think, when we think about Extension or what Extension is doing, water becomes the cornerstone to pretty much everything, agriculture, land use change, urban development. And in Florida, water is our most valuable resource. So I figured it would be really nice to have you on here because you can help talk a lot about what's happening here in Alachua County and the surrounding areas, because I think it'll help paint a clear picture on what we can expect in the future. And then also we can talk a little bit about what are we doing to help with water-related issues. So the first thing I want to ask is, could you kind of give us a little bit of background about just Florida's water resources and how they relate with Alachua County?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, water's the great unifier. It doesn't follow political boundaries and it gets into all of our programs. So it's a great place for us to work with your extension office and the University of Florida. So Florida's, it's really unique. We're this peninsula. We're surrounded by water. We have so much wetlands. We've got the springs, the rivers, the ocean, that it's so hard for people to understand that water is actually scarce. That with our population here, it's especially for people that move to the state, it's hard for them to understand that. So big picture, the biggest issues that we face in Florida are water quality, which tends to be too much nutrients that can come from a lot of various sources, and we can dive into those. So it's water quality and then water quantity. So water levels are changing, whether that's from overconsumption, all of us using the water, or from climate. Regardless, we're seeing more demands on that water. And then those two things kind of interact together and exacerbate some of the problems. So here in Alachua, we face those same issues. Obviously, land use, all of our counties are different. Some of our neighbors like Gilchrist, Columbia, agriculture is the predominant land use. Here in Alachua, we're fairly urban, as is a lot of, more southern Florida. So some of the issues and solutions look a little bit different depending on where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, when we think about what we're doing with regards to water resources, at least with the programs that we're doing in an extension or from a county perspective, it really does depend on that type of land use. And in Alachua County, we consider ourselves an urbanizing county. We have urban centers or urban parts, Gainesville, Alachua, Newberry is kind of more like a semi-urban area. But what we can what we do need to make sure is that, how are we thinking about that land use change, and what is happening with our water in relationship to that land use change. So in Florida, and you mentioned that the scarcity of water, I always like to mention that Florida has evolved around a certain amount of water. So we have our aquifers, we have our surficial waters, and the minute that we start impairing or impacting that, we're throwing that whole process, that environmental process, off. So quantity is going to be one of those big factors that we have to deal with. What's some of the big impacts or water quantity impacts that we're seeing on a regular basis here?
Yeah, so as far as impacts, as we start to see, we get our water from the aquifer, so it comes from the groundwater. So if you're purchasing water from a municipality, they're getting it from a large well. If you live in a more rural area, you have a smaller well, but it's all coming from groundwater. And that is the same source that feeds our springs, which ultimately feed our rivers, like the Santa Fe River. So as we start to pull up more water up from the wells, then the water levels drop, especially if rainfall, we're not getting a lot of rain, and a lot of times when we're not getting a lot of rain and we're in a drought, that's when we tend to use more water because our landscapes or our crops are thirsty. So as that water drops beneath us, the springs drop. So we'll start to see springs have less flow, which then can cause, it has this relationship where we'll start to see more of that algae because you don't have that water pushing the algae away. Oxygen levels change, which can change your snails. We talk about everything being all connected, and we definitely see that in our springs. We'll also see the river water start to back up into our springs because we don't have enough groundwater pushing that darker river water over. So like Rum Island is a great place where people can see that happening. We call it browned out. It's browned out more often because the river water, the spring water can't push it away. So those are some of the effects that we see. And we can also go into, start talking about, what are some of those sources? How are we using that water?
Right. And, in extension, one of the big things that we talk about with water quantity has to do with, irrigation and how we're using that water. And what is that number that we kind of attribute to like overall water use at the home? What's that like percentage that we look at for irrigation or water use?
Yeah. So especially in areas like Alachua, where it's not agricultural dominated, our water use, it's called public supply. It's the water that we're purchasing. And when we look at, how are we using that water, we typically say about 50 to 60% of the residential water budget goes out into the landscape. We've done some calculations here in Gainesville. We haven't updated in a while, that it really calculates to about 6 million gallons of water a day goes onto our landscape. So that really, can add up. And, that's a place where I think our citizens can really make a difference in their landscapes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when we're talking about when are plants growing the most, it's going to be during that warm time of the year, and that's coincidentally our rainy season. So there's a lot of times that we can actually just completely turn off any of our irrigation system, and our plants will thrive off of the water that's provided just naturally. But I mean, we see on a regular basis where people might be irrigating during those periods when it might be raining, or hopefully not when it's raining, but you still see it. But also just like the plants already have adequate amount of water, there should be no reason to water them. So that has a huge impact on that water quantity. Where else are we seeing water quantity issues outside of just that residential, like here in Alachua County? Are we seeing anything really through the well use, like with agriculture or anything like that?
Yeah, so the USGS compiles water use data every 5 years and does a report, and it's fascinating to read. You can find it online if you're into that. And here in Alachua, most of our use is public supply, but agriculture is our second biggest use. And it's, it's not that far behind. We've got a lot of blueberries and,
Right.
watermelons and things here in the area. So agriculture definitely is a use. And that data isn't metered. We know what we use in our homes because we get those bills. We don't want to get billed for something we didn't use. Statewide, we're starting to do a better job at metering data so that we can have better estimates, because if you're balancing checkbook, you need to know how much is coming out. So we are starting to see better data with agriculture. Private wells is the third largest use here. We call that domestic self-supply if you are looking at any of those reports. And the wells are tricky because people don't know how much they use. So we just estimate how much. You can get a meter. They're not that expensive if you're curious and you want to see how much that you do use from your private well.
Yeah, because I assume that if you were installing a well for private use, there is no reason for you to have a well because you're not purchasing it from anybody. It's still regulated nonetheless, but if we don't have a true understanding of that usage, it's really hard to have a good grasp on its true impacts in certain cases.
Yeah, and I would love to loop back to that that is a common misconception that if you have a well, you can irrigate your yard whenever you want to, but actually irrigation restrictions do apply to wells, or if you're pulling water from one of our lakes, you do need to follow those designated days. And our staff does enforce that. We are in areas that have higher water use, and you should see us in our new fancy vehicles. We've got this nice vehicle wrap that reminds everybody where they're getting that water from. So we do want people to, at a maximum, follow those irrigation restrictions. Like you said, even though you're allowed to irrigate once a week in the winter, you might not need to, as our plants.
Yeah, because even if we're, and I think it's important to note that, and you can help get some clarification on it, because that, what you just mentioned, at least the, not necessarily the once or twice a week, depending on the type of year, but you were referencing specifically Alachua County's irrigation ordinance, but there are still irrigation restrictions that are set up with the individual water management districts. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's statewide now all the time we have irrigation restrictions. So when I started in this field, there was only irrigation restrictions sometimes based on, where was the water in the aquifer. But now with as many people as we have here and as many landscapes, there's always irrigation restrictions. It just kind of depends what time of year we're in. And they are set by the state water management districts, but then some local governments can enforce them. And some local governments have even stricter restrictions from the water management district. So it can get tricky, but if you are here in Alachua County, you can go to alachuacountywater.org, and we've got that information there.
And ours spelled out.
Yeah, and ours are the same as the water management district, so it's pretty simple here now.
It's the same because I think that comes back to an interesting point, because you were talking about how water doesn't have political boundaries. Alachua County is split between St. Johns River Water Management District as well as the Suwannee River Management District. So, but our county-specific policy, that's based around the St. Johns River Water Management District. Is that correct?
It used to be, but now Suwannee has the same restrictions
they do? Oh, okay, wonderful.
As St. John's, but they used to not. So some of your listeners might remember that if they lived in Suwannee, they used to get to choose their days. It wasn't designated. Right. But then Suwannee changed their rules, trying to be more consistent. A few years back, during one water shortage, we were in a drought and we had to enforce these irrigation restrictions, and it was crazy. Different municipalities had different restrictions, so we're grateful that now it's more consistent.
Uniform.
Yeah,
I could definitely see how that can be difficult. So water quantity is incredibly important. We see issues, and we can easily monitor issues that have to do with fluctuating amounts of water within the aquifer or in our surficial water bodies. And we know that just stream flow, whether it be in excess associated with stormwater runoff, can lead to habitat impacts, but as well as if like lack of flow as well can have impacts on our. So it's a balance. You have to have it's like the Goldilocks effect, the just right amount of water flow. And if through urbanization, we have increased stormwater runoff, we can see more flooding events within those riparian areas. But if we're not having enough water enter that system, it obviously has its impacts as well. But, when I think about that changing land use, and if we're seeing more superficial runoff from other sources, I start to think about some of the water quality impacts associated with land use and just general Florida's water quality issues. Because, we're all familiar with the algal blooms. But I think it's important to always point out, like, what are some of those sources that lead to those blooms? What can we do better? But I also really think it's important, and I want to talk more about the water quality issues that we're seeing in Alachua County, but I also think it's important to mention that sometimes people like to point fingers at one another on who's responsible and who's not responsible. How I look at it is, as we're all Floridians, we're all responsible. Every decision that we make has an impact on water quality and quantity. So that's an important designation I like to make. But I do, some people do way better following best management practices, some do not. But I do want us to talk about what are those water quality impacts that we're having to deal with regularly here, from statewide, but also what are some things that are happening in Alachua County that, we're always trying to monitor and keep a close eye on.
Yeah, and I totally agree. There's so many sources that I think we are all part of the problem, which means we can all be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
And,
I like that.
Focus. Yeah. So focus on what everyone can do, what each sector. So, the main, water quality issue sources, is waste. So that can be from our septic systems or water treatment plants. Even though they clean up water, they still have excess nutrients depending on, the level of treatment at the different plants. So, that's one source. We also have fertilizers, which can come from people's yards or from agriculture. And then, we also have, stormwater, like you said, can be from a combination of sources. So it could have fertilizer, it could have pet waste, it can, it's a nice cocktail of potential pollutants.
And I think that brings up a good designation. A good thing to point out is there are, like, we like to categorize things. So we have two primary, like, pollutant source that we kind of, how we classify things. We have point source pollutants and non-point source pollutants. Can you kind of separate those and kind of simply say, like, what is what and how we classify those?
Yeah, so a point source pollution is basically, it's coming from a pipe. So think of a wastewater treatment plant. It cleans up the wastewater, but then it's got that water it needs to discharge somewhere. So it'll come out of a pipe and, might go to, like, Sweetwater Branch Creek here in Gainesville. So that's a point source. And it's one entity you're dealing with if you need to clean up that water. Whereas non-point source is all of us. It's just that it's a little bit of pollution from a lot of different places that then gets washed into our water bodies. And it's much harder to address because it's so diffuse. It's from so many different places. And that's our stormwater pollution for the main part.
And I think when we think about, how we're monitoring water quality, it's much easier for us to monitor point source pollutants because we know the exact source. And I mean, through the Clean Water Act, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination, I can't remember what the S means. But anyways, so from a national perspective, that's all set up. It's easy for us to monitor those water quality, that outflow's coming from those. So we can go and say, oh, this is what your outflow is. This is what you need to do to improve your water quality. But with that non-point source pollutants, when it's just kind of coming from everywhere, it's really hard to say what's coming from where, how much, and the exact sources. So that's why I really like this. Think about that we're all part of the problem, but then I also like we're also part of the solution. So when we think about, that non-point source pollution that's kind of coming off of our, that's impacting our water, what are some of those big non-point source pollutants that we need to concern ourselves with, or that we see on a regular basis?
Yeah, and we have a monitoring program. We need to get you out in the field, Taylor. You need to go out with our staff and collect some water quality samples.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll schedule it.
Yeah.
So we're trying to track down, some of those pollutants and figure out where is it coming from,
Mm-hmm.
and then can we eliminate it? And especially in urban areas, bacteria tends to be one of the issues. So it's your
like fecal coliform and stuff.
Yeah, it's fecal pollution.
Yeah,
So
E. coli.
so those sources, are pet waste.
Mm-hmm.
It can be bathrooms or remodels that have been, we call it illicit, it's an illicit discharge, but it's a illegal connection, where sometimes someone goes in and like remodels their house and they think they're connecting the new bathroom into the wastewater treatment system and sending it to get treated, but it's going into the stormwater collection system, and we later find it. So it can also be wastewater releases. Unfortunately.
So we have situations where people tie in what's supposed to be wastewater accidentally into storm drains.
Yes, so we find that sometimes with our monitoring, and GRU sometimes finds it with their smoke tests.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know that.
But that's why it's important to be out collecting samples, because we can find things like that. Another source, is our wastewater collection system. Our sewage is in pipes, but follows a lot of our creeks. Mm-hmm. So if there's an overflow, it can be impacting the water. And a big issue right now is these flushable wipes that people are marketed as flushable. Just because it can go down the toilet doesn't mean it should.
Yeah. Just the horror stories that you hear about flushable wipes. And because, when we think about which way is water flowing, when we're talking about not necessarily our streams and creeks, but our stormwater, our wastewater, they're all gravity fed. So sometimes you do have different pumps in case you have some weird elevation changes, but nonetheless, you're typically seeing in some situations like wastewater pipes, stormwater pipes, they're following those low riparian areas because that's the lowest point. So if there's any type of breakage, that can be a contaminant source. So,
and it can be really tricky because sometimes, a leak might be happening like slowly over time. And that's why it's tricky. We want people to enjoy our creeks here, but we have to be careful because there can be pollution that you can't always see pollution.
Right. Just because the water is clear doesn't mean it's clean. Yeah.
Right.
So we do have a lot of issues that we have to deal with like fecal coliform or bacteria issues associated with just human waste, pet waste. And I mean, majority of it is unintentional. Of course, you can pick up after your dog. But a lot of that is unintentional because it could be something that just a homeowner doesn't know if their system was hooked up wrong, or if there's a failure in a line somewhere, it's not going to be monitored like some of our water. If you have a pipe leaking, your water bill is going to be really high that next month, and you learn about it. So that's fecal coliform or bacterial issues that we see within the water. What's some of the other non-point source pollutants that we see on a regular basis?
Right. So we definitely have nutrients, which is mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. And as far as, non-point source pollution, I mean, that tends to be coming from people's yards. And that's something we've really been working on, is just trying to shift our landscaping paradigm a little bit. Can you have a yard that still looks good, has a place that the kids can play, holds the soil in place because we don't want erosion, but does it have to be bright green monoculture year round.
Right.
So trying to get people to manage their landscapes a little less intensively. You know, we do have our fertilizer ordinance that regulates when fertilizers can be used. And then we have an education campaign to try to encourage people to follow that and to, you know, try some new things out in their yards and see if they can still look good while, you know, not having an impact. And I know that's something you work on also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think about, you know, going back to how are we changing what landscapes are, because so much of when we're talking about like maybe fertilizer use, especially within residential areas, because that's one of our non-point source pollutant sources here in Alachua County, and statewide. And so we always promote what those best management practices are, that are the science-based BMPs. But one of the big things that we're always having to fight with is that social norm of what a landscape should look like. And that can be an uphill battle, because that's where I have to have a turf grass that looks green year round, where, I mean, here in Alachua County, they go dormant, so it's pretty much impossible, but still there's that expectation still exists to a certain extent. So that's one of our big issues, is that when there is stormwater runoff or there's poor management practices, which is common, that has an impact on our water quality, because when we're talking about fertilizers, our pollutants are nitrogen and phosphorus. So can you talk actually a little bit about our current Alachua County's fertilizer ordinance, especially with regards to like the phosphorus restrictions?
Yeah, so we just updated our fertilizer ordinance, and this applies, you know, countywide, not to agriculture. So this is really like your landscapes. And fertilizer can't have phosphorus in it unless you do a soil test or tissue test to demonstrate that really there's a need for phosphorus, because a lot of our landscapes, you know, we're pretty rich in phosphorus. That's why we have phosphate mines here. So no phosphorus unless you can demonstrate a need. And then as far as nitrogen, so we have a ban that you can really only use those fertilizers in March, April, May, and June. So that really robust growing season that we're hoping those roots are really pulling all that nitrogen up so that it's not polluting our water.
Right. And, you know, and you mentioning that understanding a deficiency, that's really, really important. And you can get soil tests done. UF offers soil tests. There's some other private labs that offer soil tests. And, you know, and we do that because nitrogen and phosphorus, they are some of our biggest pollutants. And there is no need to apply phosphorus unless there's any need to. But also applying any nitrogen, you know, you have to have good timing. When do the plants need it? But also, you can't just throw as much down as you want, because the plants can only uptake a certain amount. So anytime that you're doing bad timing or in excess, that's going to lead to, I mean, the plants are going to uptake it. So we're having pollutants essentially come from two separate directions in the urban area. So we have runoff as well as pollutant like infiltration. Can you talk a little bit about those and how we might be seeing those quality impacts?
Yeah, so Alachua County is really unique. We have all these surface waters in the eastern part where we've got a clay confining layer that kind of keeps water up close to the surface.
Yeah.
So that's where we have a lot of our wetlands like Payne's Prairie and Hatchet Creek, that whole system. On the western part of the county, we say that the aquifer is unconfined. So that means for the most part, it's basically like sandy, that if you are over irrigating, over fertilizing, it's less likely to run off. It's more likely to just percolate down into the groundwater, and then it shows up in one of our springs. So yeah, we've got a double whammy. We got to worry about what's washing stormwater, and then also what's pushing down. Because there's this common misconception. People think it's a good idea to fertilize before a rain because they want to water it in, and they want to save water, which is a good thing. But unfortunately with our rain, we tend to get these big old storms, and
Yeah.
it can push that fertilizer down. So you don't want to fertilize
Mm-hmm.
before a rain, because you might contaminate our groundwater.
Right, because that notion where people are talking about fertilizing before it rains, if you fertilize, it's important to apply just a smidgy amount of water, and that's to knock it off of the plant blades. But with a Florida rain, you're going to get in excess of that, so it's going to lead to a quick pollutant discharge, or it's going to have a very high probability that there's going to be pollutants associated with it, because when it rains in Florida, it rains.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I do want to loop back to the public perception you were talking about with our yards. We do surveys to try to see how we're doing with our education programs and our regulatory programs. And we've recently found that 55% of Alachua County residents don't fertilize at all, which is interesting, because when we've asked questions about how often do you think your neighbors fertilize, people think people fertilize more. So we might be finding that people are having landscapes that still look good without that. And it really it depends on so much, like how old is your landscape? How established is it? Do you have organic matter? Like my yard, I've never fertilized, and it's very green. I've got mixed species. So I've got stuff that some people might call a weed, but I actually like it because I see the pollinators out there. But I also don't live in an area with an HOA that's going to be upset with my mixed species yard. So it can get tricky, but we do have a lot of people that are thinking about these issues and trying out new things in their landscapes.
Right, absolutely. And I always like to differentiate that, because I know when we talk about water quality issues, turf grass commonly comes up as part of that discussion. And I always like to differentiate, like, what's a lawn and turf grass. So turf grass is a specific plant material that you can use in your lawn, and your lawn is just that space that you plant that's supposed to be for activity, and it's low-growing plant material. So we are doing some really cool research on the mixed species varieties of different plant material. And we actually had a previous podcast where we talked about that research. It was really, really neat. But yeah, you're right, is that norm, that perception, because so much of our landscape decisions are based off of, like, that idea of keeping up with the Joneses. Oh, they're doing it this way, I must do it this way too, But then, and I think that data highlights it, is if only 50% are actively fertilizing on a regular basis, but the perception is that more people are fertilizing. That goes to show that there is that idea that there's much more inputs, or more work is going into the landscapes than the data actually shows us.
Yeah.
To a certain extent.
We've played around with the idea. We actually market tested a campaign that was based on the mullet, that was have your front yard, be highly manicured, and let your backyard be wild and crazy. And
business in the front, the party in the back. Yeah.
Exactly. It didn't translate well in our graphics, and it didn't market test well, but maybe we'll figure out how to market test that.
Fair enough. I like that idea. Oh,
right. But people aren't seeing your backyard.
Right. And I think that brings us into, like, a cool segue. So, Florida's water is, we have our impacts with quality. We have our impacts with quantity. And the quantity issues are coming from everywhere. And here in Alachua County, as an urbanizing county, we're seeing a lot of it within residential, and that associated land use change and how we're managing it. So therefore, we have all these different ways, from extension as well as with Alachua County, with those strategies that we're using to help reduce that nutrient impacts, because one of our big things that we concern ourselves with is looking at today's total population. We know what that water consumption is, and if we're expected to see that population double of Florida over the next 50 years, we have that assumption that water consumption is going to double, and those water quantity issues are going to get exponentially worse. So, we're thinking of what can we do now, because we're changing. We're an urbanizing state. What are we doing, or what can we do to make sure that we are? I mean, we moved to Florida for a reason. A lot of us moved to Florida for a reason. You think about the environment. People think of the beach, the springs, water, and water is a huge component of just our state's economy. Fishing, outdoor recreation. So it's important that we protect that for just the livelihood and sustainability of the state from an economic purpose. So what are some of the things that we're doing in Alachua County, specifically with your department, Stacie, with how can we make sure that we're reducing water issues, whether it be quantity or quality related? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you're right. It's this big challenge, and we haven't even mentioned climate change, which then will change the distribution of where people are living. So we might even see more people in
inland
areas that were historically rural. So land use planning, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, so something that we've done, we have an irrigation design code that starting in 2016, any new irrigation system for landscapes has to go through an approval process, and really has to meet the best management practices to try to make sure that any new irrigation systems are as efficient as possible, and we're shrinking the footprint of it. We don't want the whole yard to be irrigated, and can you use your micro irrigation on your shrubs and things like that. And we are right now looking at potentially requiring soil amendments for new constructions, because we know sometimes new landscapes, because of the way we do construction now, they're kind of on life support. They need irrigation and fertilizer to do well, because the soil is it's like sand. It's like putting some sod on.
Archer fill sand, where it's just sterile sand pretty much. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. So we're looking at potentially requiring some soil amendments so that we give those landscapes a jump start, and then they won't have as much of a impact. So in 2021, we'll most likely, propose that. Septic systems are something that other areas have more of a problem with, because they've got more septic systems on these small lots. We definitely have septics in this area, not as many. And we're also looking at, there's newer technology for reducing the nutrients from those systems. So just kind of in the drain field, can you add some organic matter and make the nitrogen cycle happen?
And isn't the county testing one of those newer systems out at Post Springs? Is that where that's at?
Yes. So we did the lodge at Post Springs and the concession stand. Those were both on septic systems, and we retrofitted those, and they are ready. So once Post Springs opens back up, I hope people go and use that restroom, because we have monitoring equipment there, and we're going to be looking at that water quality and seeing what are those improvements there. So there's thoughts of, do we start to require new systems to have that technology? We're looking into the costs and the data, because we always have to weigh all of these things. And we're seeing improvements with our wastewater treatment.
Absolutely.
There's more infiltrating wetlands to kind of have that polishing step with our wastewater.
And everyone loves Sweetwater Wetlands Park. I mean, that's a wonderful place, and the impacts it has on water quality is just tremendous compared to, obviously, prior to Sweetwater Wetlands Park.
Yeah, and it's always great when you can be removing pollution and then also creating a recreation site and a great educational experience. So
absolutely. So I want to ask, so you're doing a lot of outreach with the irrigation, doing different requirements. You're looking at some of code changes, because I know Alachua County is looking at the Unified Land Development Code updates, as well as you have some of these different ordinances and policies. What other outreach programs are you all doing to help with water quality and quantity for homeowners? So say one of our county residents is listening in. What are some good ways, or what are those resources that you all can provide to those homeowners?
Yeah, so right now we have our turf swap landscaping rebate program, which I believe there's a podcast on, where people can get a 50% rebate up to $1,500 to make some of those changes and start to convert to a Florida friendly landscape. So, that's a great one. Our website, we've got myyardourwater.org. Also, I mean, that's got all the regulations so people can see it. And it's got tips also. So, for example, with irrigation, asking people to, just because you can irrigate doesn't mean you need to,
Right.
turn it off and then just use it as needed. And we are doing a lot of education right now to just help people to understand their connection to our water. We found in our survey that I think it was greater than 50% didn't understand that our drinking water comes from the aquifer, from the groundwater.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, a lot of the kids know it because we're teaching that stuff in the schools now. But some of us that didn't get to do fun environmental programs in school, a lot of people don't know. They know they turn the sink on and there's their good drinking water.
I always like to ask people, like, where do you live? Because I think that's important, because when you think about that, I think of those geopolitical boundaries. I live in Gainesville, or like I live in High Springs, I live in Alachua County or Florida. But when we're talking about water connection, I think that's really important, because I want you to talk a little bit about it, because maybe you've seen those benefits of, if we start thinking about where we live from an environmental perspective. Like I live within the Santa Fe River watershed. So like I know that my behaviors impact the Santa Fe River really easily, and then everything downstream from that, so the Swanee River, etc. But we learn that there are some impacts. Just understanding that connection with water is tremendous. Are you seeing that in any of that that data that you've collected?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a little bit more awareness, especially with like stormwater, people understanding that goes to a natural water body. We've been running our no filter campaign. I think about it, up by the Satchel's Pizza area, like the whole northeast of Gainesville, there's some old, ditches from when this area was developed. I like to call them an ephemeral stream, but most people call them a ditch. And all of that eventually goes to Noonan's Lake. Yeah. And, that's something we've been trying to develop a program that we could do with Howard Bishop and Metcalf and the schools on this side of town to really bring that message home. Because, I notice a lot of trash getting thrown, and that's a really good way, because it's so visual, you can see trash.
Right.
So that's to start educating people about, you wouldn't throw this, snack wrapper in Noonan's Lake, but if you're throwing it in the storm drain or in the road, you basically you're
doing the same exact thing. Yeah, it just takes a little bit to physically get there, but so I want, so those outreach campaigns are very, very important, because if we're starting to think about how do we make these adjustments going in the future, thinking about Florida's and Alachua County's water quality, it's important that we start having these conversations with the public so we can create these changes, because a lot of times it might be just a knowledge. You change someone's knowledge, they immediately make that behavior change. But we know that a knowledge gain does not equate to behavior change, but there's more factors that are associated with that, like those social norms. So how are we shifting those social norms to have a deeper understanding of what our impacts are and how those landscapes can become to help improve and protect water quality, Florida's sustainable future? So I think going forward, I think it's important us to, that I would like to ask you is, going forward, what would be that big overarching statement that you could give to anybody listening about Florida's water resources and how we move forward into the future with regards to the water?
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected. That what we all do in our landscapes, in our homes, in our businesses, affects the whole system. So really try and get people to see that connection. And, I think we can get caught up in that pointing of fingers. So helping like that we're all in this together. So really those small changes I can make in my yard are just as important as, the changes that can happen on that farm or that water bottle plant, whatever it is that, we're focused on, that we have a responsibility, we have a part in it.
Right. It's not an I question, it's a we. Statements especially. So So Stacie, I want to thank you for coming in and taking the time and meet with us to talk on just Florida's water quality issues and what we're doing in Alachua County and ways that we can move forward, because I think what you presented today is going to be incredibly informative to all of our listeners, especially the ones here in Alachua County. But I think it's important to note that if anybody has any questions, they can reach out to Alachua County's Extension Office regarding any of our programs like the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, or we can connect you with Stacie and her office and how to get you connected with all the resources that the county provides through the Environmental Protection Department here. So Stacie, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Taylor, you are such a great extension agent for this community. We are so lucky to have you, and I'm just so glad that we get to work together so much. So thanks for helping to get the word out. We're happy to help with anything. We've got great staff that love to answer questions also. So thank you, and we hope to come back.
Oh, absolutely. We'll have more conversations, that's for sure. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.